meeting you right where you are on your foster care journey. This is the Forgotten Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Forgotten Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Cabe, and I am so happy to be with you. If you are part of the foster care community, passionate about serving, or simply interested in learning more, we are here for you. In every episode of this podcast, you will hear stories from men and women who have experienced foster care to one degree or another. They may have grown up in the system, are caseworkers, foster parents, or others who are here to bring you hope or encouragement. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. And remember, you are not alone. I hope you enjoy the Forgotten Podcast. Today, I am grateful to have Dr. Danisha Keating with me on the podcast. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. Danisha is a former foster youth and was a guardian of five of her siblings. She loves to encourage both foster youth to really go after their dreams and goals. And she also wants to encourage and loves encouraging foster care advocates to provide support to the foster youth in their life. Her journey has not been an easy one, and yet it has been part of her finding really her life's work. So let's dig in. Danisha, as you think about your childhood, and thank you for being on. Let's start there. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I want to kind of dive into your childhood because it seems like there were specific ages that marked kind of moments, big moments in your life. Yes. And the first one that you have shared with us prior was 13 when CPS became involved in your life. However, I would love it if we could back up just a little bit earlier, well, kind of a lot earlier, and give me, what are your very first memories of childhood?
Well, I feel like the very, very, very first memory I have is probably not a very nice one. It's very sad. Mm-hmm. But the first one that I have was like 4 years old. It's a God moment though. So it's one of those things where I think the first time I remember experiencing God, I was 4, and in my family, there's a lot of us. I'm one of 11. And at that point I was probably at 4, I was one of 4, but I remember, just kind of hearing my mom talk about foster care, because she grew up in the foster care system. And she would say, like, don't mess up. Like, if you mess up, foster care is going to get you. If you mess up, they're going to take you away. And it was just this hard reality of like, you've gone through stuff. We'd ask things like, she'd say, I was sexually abused in the foster care system. I'm like, what does that mean? And she would go and talk about this stuff. And we would learn very young, like, if you messed up, you're going to get taken away. If you say anything wrong, you don't know. And I remember there was just this moment of, I always thought it was a garage sale, but it turned out it wasn't. It was CPS in our home. And they were having these conversations like, oh, does your mommy and your daddy do XYZ? Like, here's this. And I remember this lady consistently coming in and then leaving. And it was someone who was just kind of with CPS, because that was kind of the first report of neglect. And then, there was another moment where I was probably like 6, but my parents forgot that they left me in the van after going to Bible study. And there was just this feeling of, you're always forgotten. And that kind of carried throughout my life. But in that moment, this is where I remember we lived in Los Angeles in a place called Southgate. It's very close to Compton. So it's drive-by shootings, gang life, all of this stuff in the 90s. And I remember being in the van and looking at the door, and I said, God, I don't want to leave. There's bad guys out there. And he said, trust me, you're going to go. And I was like, no, I don't want to. And I'm a baby at this point. I'm a little kid. Yeah. And I remember his voice just saying, we're going to count to 4 and you're going to go. And I counted to 4, and the door, I didn't touch the door. I just opened, like I just pushed it, walked into the gate, knocked on the door, and started just calling for my parents. And they're like, why are you outside? I'm like, you guys forgot me. And that just over and over again, like when I look at some of my story, I would always ask people, like, if I hadn't seen them in a long time, I'd be like, do you remember me? Like, did you forget about me? And that kind of transformed into a lot of the issues that personally I faced, but always God's voice came back in of like, I know you, I got you, but it was hard at moments to be like, were you really there, God? But then looking back, I'm able to say, here's where he always has been. But with that first core memory, it was like, you're always forgotten. No one remembers you. You will be abandoned. And you carry that for the rest of your life.
Wow. Yeah. And I also am recognizing your parents saying, or your mom saying, like, if you do this, then foster care will enter. So it was you're in charge of, right? Like it's on you. And isn't that something that you felt like, or that can be such a misconception in the world too, that
absolutely.
Kids go into foster care because of what they did.
Yes.
So speak what is true about that first. Well, go ahead with what you were going to say.
The truth is it's not our fault, but there were so many times, even from a young age to being a teenager and taking in my siblings as a young adult, I heard that all the time. Like, well, what did you do? My caseworker, when I was put in high school, he actually, like, there was preventative measures happening, conversations where they try to prevent that from happening. And it was, Danisha, don't mess up. If you fail a quiz, like he told me, he had a whole conversation. He goes, if you fail a quiz, if you don't come home right after school, if you ditch school, if you do anything wrong, you're the reason foster care happened. And that was reiterated by my parents of like, if you don't come in home and take care of the kids and feed them and do their homework with them, if they're taken away, this is on you. And I remember I was 14 at that point. And I remember standing in the quad at high school and I was doing something for color guard, trying to pass high school because I was put in late and super behind. And I looked at the person telling me like, foster care will be your fault. And I was like, I'm just trying to pass school and I'm 14. And a week later, all of it happened. And I blamed myself forever. And it wasn't until I was like 19 or 20 that someone looked at me and they said, Danisha, this was not your fault. And you've been carrying that forever. And every foster care kid I've talked to, they have been told, what did you do? And I'm like, this is not foster care doesn't happen because of the children. Foster care happens because the parents, what we're doing something bad and not changing that. It could be neglect. It could be abuse. It could be all of it together. And I mean, last year I've had people ask that same question, like, well, what did you do? Like, why didn't you help your parents more? Why didn't you prevent this? And I looked at someone and I said, I was 14, 15 years old. Like, you cannot put parent responsibility on me, but people do. And I think sometimes there's this misconception, especially unfortunately within the church, when someone hears foster care, they hear jail, they hear juvenile hall, they hear delinquent young adult. And it breaks my heart because it's one of those things that I'm like, this had nothing to do with them. If they had the control, if they had the person listening to their voice, they wouldn't have had this. And that was always my consistent thing with my foster care caseworkers. I was like, if you let me take control, this would be fine. But you're telling me to butt out. Well, I've been doing the work of a parent. You're telling my older sister butt out. You're telling my brothers who are trying to help this situation to be a kid, but we're the ones who have been the adults since we were 8, 9 years old, not taking care of, raising our siblings. And if it was up to us, we would be just fine. But you don't recognize a 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 10-year-old as parents, which it's the right thing. You don't, that's not how it's supposed to be.
Right.
But then there is this whole thing where foster youth we first feel that it's our fault. And that goes back to our identity, our self-worth is like, I must have done something wrong. And then people speak back into that and say, well, what did you not do? What did you do wrong? Why didn't you help your parents? And I have had in multiple conversations when I do speaking engagements, when someone has asked that question, you see like so many of the adults, they go like, why are you asking this? And I'm like, there was nothing I could do. I did everything right. But I think there's still, even with some foster parents, because I think they may see cases where it's like, okay, there was like 2% of foster care were released from a home because of their behavior. But I'm like, their behavior is stemmed in the abuse that they went through, and they were children. And I love that you said, because they're children. And we look at kids and young adults and teenagers who have been abused or hurt, and we go, well, you should just fix it. And it's like, there's a response happening to what they've gone through. And when you're a child having adult emotions and not being walked through that, you can't make adult decisions because you don't know those decisions, but you have adult emotions, and you're just like, handle yourself the right way. It doesn't work. And so it's hard to have those conversations, but sometimes I'm like, Lord, thank you for letting that question be asked so we can address the misconception. Sure. But it is hard to hear. Sometimes I leave, I'm like, oh, I'm so angry that was asked. But I'm like, in the end, I'm like, you know what though? There's someone in that room who needed to hear this was not your fault and you could not control it. You did everything right. You did the best that you can. And I'm sorry that your parents at that time couldn't or did not do what they needed to do. And no one spoke truth into you in that moment. And so my hope would be, if anyone is listening to this and maybe they feel that is like, you did the best that you could, this was not your responsibility. This was not your fault. You did everything you could. And that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. There's a lot of things going through my head right now. One is, it seems like you were hearing so many really mixed messages. On one hand, you're hearing you're forgotten. On another hand, you're hearing you're responsible. On another hand, you're hearing it's your fault. So, and you're supposed to be the parent, and you're not supposed to be the parent. I mean, that is, I remember when we were in foster care classes, to become foster parents, my husband and I, and one of the things they talked about that has continued to stick with me, and it reminds me of what you're saying, is like kids who've gone through such trauma or abuse or neglect, like they have a physical age. They might be 5. They have a developmental age. And if they haven't had those healthy building blocks, they might be more like 2 developmentally. And then they have an experiential age where they maybe have experienced things many adults have never experienced. And I think it's what you're saying with those adult emotions. Like you feel the responsibility of being an adult, and yet you're a kid. And it's just a spiral. How do you even know where to start?
Absolutely. And I've had to process this my whole life because it's always, I would be in conversations where people my age, I always struggled with, in high school. So I was homeschooled before I was put into high school. I was homeschooled from pre-K all the way to the middle of 9th grade year of high school. I was put in March of the school year, and the school year ended in June. So they were like, we're going to have to fail you. You can't succeed in this. And I'm like, yes, I can. They're like, no, you physically can't. Like, there's no way. But being amongst 15-year-olds, they're worried about college and passing their class and boyfriends. And I'm over here like, I'm worried about if my siblings are going to eat. I'm worried about getting home on time to work with homework with them. I'm worried about walking home and picking them up to walk home and being like, is my mom going to come home tonight? Is my dad even going to come home this weekend? And are we going to get hit if we walked in the door? Because every day was so different, where we could walk home and be home and no doors were locked on us. We could come home and my mom shutting us out, saying you're out, you're kicked out, whatever. Or my dad being like, I'm going to take you and beat you and then whatever, whatever the case. And it's like, you never knew what was going to happen. So when people are like, oh, what are you doing for your life? I'm like, I'm surviving.
I'm surviving.
And everyone who always asks the question, and I'm like, we need to stop asking this, because I think it causes a lot of anxiety to everybody, but with people who are in the trenches of survival, asking them what their 5-year plan is. It's like my answer, I would be in interviews and I'm like, not die. And someone was like, oh, that's kind of, and I'm like, I don't know. I guess I would hope that I could stay with the company. But at 15, it was, what's your 5-year plan? Where are you going? And I'm like, wherever I go, I have to have a room or a place or a space in my life to stay close to my siblings so that if something happens, I can take them. And I lived that way for so long. And people my age were always like, you always try to be the mom. You're trying to be more mature than us. And I'm like, I'm not trying. Like, this is who I am. I take care of people, but at the expense of myself. Mm-hmm. And that's something I had to relearn. And I always would gravitate toward older adults. And this is where the like, looking back, I'm like, that's really scary, especially with so many children getting targeted for additional abuse as they grow older, human trafficking, exploitation. And what happens at this age is when you're 15 years old and you can't connect with people who are 15 to 18, you start looking to people who are older. And I started looking at men who were 28 years old, 30 years old, and I started developing relationships with them. They weren't teachers. They could have been mentors. They could have been someone who was a brother or, a friend of someone else. And I realized, I think I was like 16 and I was in a relationship with someone who was 28, and I didn't see anything wrong with it because we mentally connected. Wow. And I'm like, okay. And then I realized, like, someone else brought it up and I was just like, oh, he's really old. Like, he has a kid and I'm in high school. Like, that's probably not a good idea. We never met, but it was all like through calls and like internet. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, this is how people get targeted, is that sometimes there is an innocent where it's just that person might be 28, but mentally they're really 15. Okay. But there are people prying on children and never should that be a cross ever when they're under the age of 18. But I realized that, like, I would always gravitate toward my teachers and be like, I want to hang out with you guys because you have that life experience that I have at that same age. And most of the time the teachers didn't even know that I was going through something. It wasn't until I was taken away and then they were like, okay, now something's happened. But then after all of that settled down, like my junior, senior year, my teachers didn't know what was going on. So, there was emotional and disruption in the classroom. I would get sassy, or I would, someone from church would be like, we want to be your mom, or we want to be, someone who pours into you. And that always was a very bad thing for me, because if someone said, I want to be your mom, it was, I want to abuse you and use you. I want you to do what I have to say. So it's like, if you're in this situation, if you're feeling this emotion, the first thing that you have to recognize is there's nothing wrong with you. You're not crazy. You're living in a different life, but it doesn't mean that you have to be the adult in the room. You don't have to take that responsibility on, and you can just kind of say, you know what, I need people to help me process this. And be in a safe environment, because if not, we are going to run to people who are prying on us and we don't even know until it's too late. And I look back at my life where I'm like, there are so many times that I would stay at random people's houses. Like, I would meet them first day of college or first day in high school and be like, hey, we're going to be friends now. And there was an older brother or an older sister who were a little shady. And I'm like, I could have ended up on drugs, in jail, in gangs, trafficked. Like, all of these things should and could have happened, but they didn't, because I think obviously God's hand was on me, but also too, there were other people willing to speak up and say, hey, you're 15, you shouldn't, he's 28, he's just in a different life point. Not like, hey, he's out to get you, but just really saying, like, he's in a different life season than you are. And like, you might be able to emotionally and mentally connect with him, but right now, like, he's looking for like marriage and commitment and this and that. And you're just needing someone to care and listen to you. So as a teacher, like, I would want to offer that to you as well. Like, if you're looking for friendship is really what you're looking for someone to say, I see you and I validate you. I know you. I understand this is hard. I'm here for you. I'm going to partner with you, instead of just being like, oh, that troubled kid, which I would still get from a lot of people. this is where, like, this is how, if anyone's listening, is like, I understand you want to gravitate toward those older adults, but make sure that they are safe. And if anyone's seeing this kind of thing happening with kids, it's like, step in and just be like, I want to be a good resource for you. I want to partner with you, but I don't want to be your parent, because they don't need a parent. And I would say that I remember so many people. There was one person in particular. He's like, I want to be your mom and like guide you and shape you and love you. And I was like, I don't need a mom. I haven't done a bad job raising myself. And she's like, that's not it. And I'm like, I pushed her away so hard, because I was just like, but when you want to, like, the only times that we're talking is when you want to correct me. And I don't think my behavior is unjust right now, because you just don't like that I didn't answer the question this way. I'm very blunt. You don't like that. And that was what it was. She's like, you're just really hard, and like, come down with like your nose. And I'm like, yeah, no, I know. Like, I'm not gonna hide the ugly. And she's like, but that's not something people want to know. And I'm like, I'm not going into detail. I'm just like, not everyone has picture perfect life, and that's okay. But some people don't want to hear that. So when you hear, a kid pushing back, or a young adult pushing back and being like, I don't need your expertise or coaching, it might be because they've had a very poor upbringing of someone coming alongside of them to use them. And that's been something I've had to work through, to be like, not everyone's trying to like abuse you or use you or manipulate you. But that's the first thought that goes into my head, is like, someone's like, hey, can we? And I'm like, what do you want from me? What does this entail? What, like, so I'm very guarded, and I've gotten better, but there's still that first initiation of like a conversation. I'm like, what do you want? Just because it's life. And then that's how emotions process.
They do, absolutely. And you have to recognize that, and then kind of decide, okay, is this true or not? Something you mentioned about how we need to talk with trusted people, and yet you're very it's easy to find untrustworthy people. I think it speaks a lot to, if you are someone who works with students or who works with children, making sure, as a trustworthy person, that you are reaching out to these kids in a way that is healthy, in a way that is not, I can understand, like, I want to be your mom. That feels pretty intrusive. But how about showing how we want to care for someone, just doing it, as opposed to telling them what we want to do, I think is helpful. Yeah. Seems helpful.
Absolutely. And I think too, it's just, one of the teachers that I had in high school, he was our choir teacher. And then there was a band director. Both of them showed up to meetings and just said, like, how are you? Like, we know you had court today. What's going on? But they didn't do, like, I know today we have texting and Facebook and stuff like that. And that can get very dangerous, even just perception. So sometimes our intent is really good, and we want to be like, how are you? What's going on? And there might be a late night text message, even though you're just saying, how are you? Someone else can say, well, why are you texting them at 11 o'clock at night? And it's the perception. And so it's like, okay, how about tomorrow, instead of texting at 11 o'clock at night saying, how did it go? Tomorrow you follow up and you're just like, hey, I just wanted to see how you're doing. I know yesterday was hard. I wanted to give you some space, but I'm looking at my intention and the perception. And when we're really able to do that, there's no way that someone can misinterpret the perception, because we're thinking through both of those steps. And just being there, like, I know so many teachers, and the best thing that they've ever done was just open their classroom during lunchtime. That was it, and the choir director, what he had in his room, he'd have like little chip bags. And he's always like, hey, if anyone needs anything, I know there's extra in here. I brought too many. Like, he would never be like, hey, kids who are poor, like, I have chips in the room if you can't eat. He's just like, oh, guys, I bought too many, accidentally bought one, and my son bought another, but I brought the extras here for you guys. He'd bring donuts in the morning. He would do little things that he never made us feel like we were singled out or called out. So if he knew one student was struggling in his class, he's like, there must be more that just aren't saying it. And to me, it's like, how do we show up well for people and like not isolate them or call them out or single them out? This is how. It's just saying, you know what, there's one person in my environment that might be struggling. We don't know what's behind the scenes. So I'm going to treat everyone like there's more happening behind the scenes. And
That's
I'm
so
just going to
good.
show up and try to be well, but I'm not trying to save everybody, because that's where our intention is. Like, we just want to save everybody. And I'm like,
Yeah.
we can't physically do it. But
Right.
there's that saying that they said, if you want to go far or go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go strong and well and further, go together. So if teachers are rotating snack times or classroom lunches, you might not be able to do every day, but what you could say is, hey, Wednesdays, we're going to all go over to Miss Carol's class. And then on Thursdays, we're going to go over to Mr. Sanchez's class, and we're just going to have like lunch, bring your lunch, and we're just going to be over there. So then it's more of communal community versus one teacher trying to save the whole school, because that's nearly impossible. And I know there's grading and things like that, but just being intentional of like, what's my intention and what's my perception that I'm giving.
Yes. Well, I'm loving this intention and perception. I think that's really, really good and important. It's something I haven't thought about in that way before. And also the whole savior mentality is just so unhealthy. I mean, we're not the savior. We're not the heroes. Like, Jesus Christ is the savior, and we get to participate. But as soon as I start putting myself on a level above somebody else, that's a problem, even with quote good intentions. And I say quote because I don't, I might have what I think are good intentions, but beneath those intentions are I'm better than them in some ways, right? It's and we don't want to go there. It's unhealthy. We need each other.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of funny because when I've shared my story, some people are like, so why do you feel like you have to be the hero? And I'm like, what? That never crossed my, like, I feel like I failed in so many different ways and didn't handle myself the way that I should. And I've had conversations with people about processing that, because it's like, I lost my cool. I didn't have the money, just because there was a lot that went on with our case. But there is this understanding of, there are some people out there wanting to be the heroes. And so when they question your hero mentality, they're really questioning themselves. And so when I go into every conversation, it's like, I did what I knew was the right thing to do. But I talked to someone and they said it, and he raised some of his siblings as well. And he said, I was young and I thought like, I'll figure it out like I always do. But looking back, you're like, oh, I should have fallen on my face. Like, I should have not done as well as I did do. Yes, I could have changed things and I could have been better. But at 24 years old, taking in 5 siblings who ranged from 12 years old to 18 years old, I had to step back and be like, dang, I did pretty good. But like, I did have that, like, I can take over the world. It'll be fine. We'll figure it out. But not really as an adult thinking through like the logistics of every little detail. And maybe that was in my benefit, but it was one of those things that it's a reality of like, when we're younger, we're like, let's just get it done. When we're older, it really does start to become about more of like, well, how does this make me look good? How do I benefit from this? And that's not good to do in the foster care community, because every foster youth will know if you are there for them or there to be self-gratified through your hero mentality, and they'll call it out. And it's kind of sad sometimes when you're just like sitting there and someone's like, you're not here to actually help us. You're just here because you're either paid to be here, you're forced to be here, or you want people to like boost your ego. And you can tell the difference between someone who wants to be the hands and feet of Jesus and someone who's like, look at my resume.
Wow.
And that's never a good feeling to be on the, here's my resume for what I've done.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I do think that some of that youth zeal, that probably helps many survive in some ways, right?
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
That age, like you said, you're just like, it is survival mode. It's like we do what we have to do. Yeah.
There's no other option at that point too.
Right.
Yeah.
Man. So you had mentioned when in some of our research here, you had mentioned 13 years old was when CPS got involved, but was it not until later that you actually let's talk about that.
Yeah. So CPS got involved in the beginning, okay, parents are separated, situations happened. under care of mom, and 13, they're coming in and they're like, okay, well, you guys are all homeschooled. And at first she was not working, and then they came back in and they're like, you have to get a job. We have to show that you're efficient on your own. And it wasn't until I was in my freshman year that they were like, you have to put these kids in school. Cause I had been homeschooling them from 13 on to like 14.
You had been homeschooling.
And then I had been. And before that, we were homeschooling each other, like as siblings homeschooling. Siblings are teaching ourselves. And so I remember this is me being Zill. I remember having the conversation with the caseworker, and she's like, you have to put them in school. And I'm like, I've been homeschooling them. They're fine. They're learning. I got this. Like, and she looked at me and she's like, you're 13. You can't homeschool them. And I was like, I've been homeschooling them. Like, it's not that I can't, it's not that I'm trying to, like, I have been. Right. And she was just like, no. And I remember it took a while for my mom to put us into school. But then once my mom started working, she started finding people and dating people and just like being gone for a couple of days and then coming home. And if she was home, she wasn't really home. Like, she was in her room, and it was still us doing all of this ourselves. And I'm not sure who reported it. But I was pretty sure it was one of my high school teachers and maybe one of the middle school teachers, but they looked at the situation. And they're like, there are kids running around the neighborhood with no shoes on. They have dirty clothes all the time. They're always asking for milk and butter and sugar. And I'm like, that's really sad. Like, you shouldn't report that. But it was all the other stuff that I didn't see at the time.
A whole bunch of things.
And CPS then came in when it was October 9th of 2006. It was 3 days before my birthday. And they came in and they just said, it's time to go. This is not working. She's not doing what she needs to do. Then my mom was arrested, and we were all split up between 3 different homes. Cause there was, at that point, there was 8 of us still at home. And so, 3 were at my sister's house, and then the other of us were at 2 different foster homes. And my first response was, CPS, you're an idiot. I'm the parent here. Like, I'm the one doing this. And I yelled at him, and he was just laughing, and he's like, you don't get to tell me what to do. And I'm like, in this moment of freak out, I'm angry, and you're the one telling me, like, we're moving your schools. And he said, you're never going to be around your friends again. You're never going to see your siblings again. Oh. And I was like, this is a lot of information. And one of the other guys that was with him was just like, dude, chill. Like, let's take it one step at a time. Like, we don't know what's going to happen. But this guy was just like, I don't care about your feelings. And he would tell me all the time, like, your case is nothing to me. Like, it's nothing to me. Like, this is just another situation. Yours isn't as bad as the baby on the breathing machine who just got beat up to a pulp. And I'm like, I get beat all the time. Like, obviously, no, a baby shouldn't be beaten, but like, my situation is just as serious because now you're uprooting everything.
Oh yeah. He was not in the right field of work.
No, maybe sales would be better. But that happens and that's where, it's hard to hear, I think, as a caseworker. And I do want to say there are good caseworkers out there. But there are still some not great ones out there, and they're still making it even harder for, like, the situation's already hard. But when you come in laughing at people and mocking them, telling them that you're just like, maybe sometimes it's just too much information, and it feels like you're just saying, like, I'm going to mock you in this moment because I'm ruining your life. Like, there's a time and place. Like, if it's a Saturday, let's have that conversation on Monday. Like, hey, it's a Friday, tomorrow you're going to, like, you don't just say, we're already enrolled you, you're already moving to this other place that really was just a couple cities over. But it made it seem like he was, like, taking me out of the state. And I was like, I don't even know where that place is. Like, I'm processing all of this. But a parent from one of the bands, because I was at Color Guard at that point, and we had just gotten back from a trip. And there were a lot of rumors spread about, like, me being arrested. And, like, someone comes and picks you up from school and they say the cops have been looking for you for 3 days. Like, sure, it does look like you're arrested. Which was a very funny story to be like, yeah, I'm back from jail. Like, but that's not really my story. But one of the moms from one of the band's, moms came in, and she heard how I was speaking, and she's like, she goes, I know you're mad, but we don't talk to people like that. And she's like, you have every right to be mad, but we don't cuss people out. And she goes, I'll talk to him, but let's pray. And I was just like, I'm not really talking to God right now. Like we're on a timeout. And she's like, it's time to take him out of the timeout. Wow. And she just prayed with me, and I just like lost it. And just, that was like one of the first and last times I cried, until I was 22. Wow. When someone walked me through of like, we need to process your emotions. And I was like, I can't cry. Like, I will not cry. Because it means letting down my guard and exposing everything internally. And so when she prayed with me in that moment and I just lost it, it was hard to realize how long CPS had been happening. And in that moment and after that moment, a lot of people who would look at our case, they were like, why did it take them 2 to 3 years to take you guys away? And I'm like, I don't know, because, preventative measures. And that preventative measure was randomly checking in, and randomly, whatever. And I actually lived in a very not so great county where this happened all the time. So, there were instances where it was like, this kid should have been removed a long time ago, and now they're hospitalized because of the abuse, and you guys didn't act. And they're like, well, we were trying to do ways to help. And I'm like, preventative measures work great when it's things like neglect and not having the money, the resources for food and babysitting and things like that. It doesn't work great when the person's physically and sexually and emotionally abusive. It doesn't. Right. It's just prolonging them being in this ugly environment. And it's really hard to, this is just because some parents, they know how to abuse, and a lot of it's emotional, but then they hit you in places where you're not necessarily going to be able to show a teacher where the bruises are. I can't really just lift up my shirt and be like, hey, here's my ribs, here's my back, here's my butt, where it's all bruised, without exposing body parts. So it's like, when someone wants to hide the abuse, they know how to do it. And that's not, I shouldn't laugh, but it's just, it's one of those realizations. Like, that's why some of these cases get prolonged, is not just because the parents are really good at hiding things, but because some of the caseworkers are really trying to do preventative work. And both my parents, like, people have said, like, both your parents are master manipulators. They're really good at hiding things, to the point of, like, people looked at them and they were like, they could have never done that. And I'm like, I know, the person you see in the world is not the person you see behind closed doors. And that was a hard reality to know, really that there were so many times that CPS, like other people who are caseworkers, were like, I would have taken you out at that point. I would have not allowed this. Like, your jaw got dislocated and your mom pulled a knife on you and the cops got called, and no one ever stepped in and said, hey, this probably isn't a good environment for these kids to continue to be in. But police just kind of went, okay. Which later I found out it's actually, one of the reasons was, one of my parents was fairly close to that county's police department and to the caseworkers, and would get in friendly. So it was like, oh no, that was a misunderstanding. Like, this and this and this is actually what happened. They don't know. And so people are like, oh my gosh, you're so charismatic. You're so this, you're so that. You couldn't be abusive. And there was just like a wool over their eyes. So it was sad to see, like, other caseworkers were like, I would have taken you out at that point. And I'm like, I know, I would have too, but this happens all over the place. This is not a first. And then there's cases out there that we've heard of where it's like complete misunderstandings and kids are taken away for years. And I'm like, right. It is broken. Like, so it's like, it's ugly. It's a very broken system.
Yeah.
It's hard. Wow. That's hard.
And I'm sure that then, if your parents are charismatic, master manipulators, how much more are you thinking, well, maybe it is my fault?
All the time. How much more I deserved it, how much more I misinterpreted. There was, for me personally, there was a lot of, sexual abuse and spiritual abuse that happened. And so with spiritual abuse, when someone's looking at the Bible and saying, well, do you see this verse? Like, do you see that this is okay that I do this to you? Do you see that this is biblical for me to discipline you in this way? You start to go, okay, well, this is, why would God design it this way? Like, that was always my, like, that's why I, like, for so long, I was like, God, I don't trust you. Like, Why would you set it up this way? Like, why is that okay? Like, why would you let parents do this to their kids and justify it? And then rereading the whole Bible and going through some classes of like really learning the content and the context.
Right.
I was like,
and the context.
oh
Exactly.
my gosh. And a lot of people still do that, where they'll just read the content, but not learn the context. And I'm like, guys, there's reasons why the context is important. It would be the same thing as if I'm just like, hey, I'm going to teach you how to cook today, and I'm not going to teach you why you can't just leave the gas on. Like there's a context behind just clicking the button. And I mean, like, you don't want to gas your house out, but if you don't wait for that fire to come on, you're missing the context behind the content, because you're saying, here, I turned it, I did what I was supposed to do. But it's like, yeah, but you gassed the house out because you didn't wait for the light to come on and the pilot to come on and the fire to come on, and then moved the button back to where it needed to be. So to me, it's just like, there was so many times that I was like, I deserve this. I stepped out of line. I dressed the wrong way. I spoke the wrong way. I did this the wrong way. If I had, it always comes back down to like, if I had stopped focusing on high school and passing my classes and focused on the kids, this would have never happened. And that's where a friend stepped in. I was like 22 years old. And she's like, you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, and it's not your fault. And like, we sat and I just cried. That was the first time I cried again, because it was like, holy crap. Like, that's, maybe you shouldn't say that on a podcast, but like, this is a lot. Like, it's the first time recognizing at 22 in 22 years that this was not my fault. The abuse was not my fault. Foster care was not my fault. Having to go back through this at 24, picking up my siblings again, there was a lot of blame. Like, well, if I had fought harder, if I had pressed charges, if I let him do it again, so that, or let my parents beat me again and shown the bruises, maybe, just maybe this wouldn't have happened to the rest of my siblings again for the second time. And someone was like, Danisha, this is not about you. This is about your parents. This is about what they did not do and what they should have done. And that, like, it is, I'm 33 now. It has taken 33 years for me to say that was never my fault. That was not. And when I hear other people in the community say, like, well, what did you do? Or like, is it true that foster care get moved from homes because of their behavior? And I say, we're mixing two things together here.
Yes.
That they were never put in because of their fault. But maybe they're moved because of how they're responding to things, but that is directly related to the trauma that they're going through. And they don't know how to respond because they're in survival mode. They're in freak out mode. They're in this moment of just like, I have no idea how else to respond. I have adult emotions in a teenage body that I have not been allowed to process. Not that I have not been allowed to process in a safe environment. So now they're trying to just survive. And so this conversation needs to be cared for and loved on, where it's like, this is not your fault.
Right.
And I'm not here to say, well, you should have done better. I'm here to say, like, what can we do to help you understand that this was not your fault? Yes.
Wow. Danisha, I feel like there's so many more things I could ask you. I appreciate your message, your heart, your openness. And I really do believe that there are many who need to hear this, I see why you're passionate about the things you are, and your voice is needed. And so keep sharing. Man, I just believe strongly that there are people, former foster youth listening right now, who need to know this is not your fault, and have the freedom to process the anger, the hurt, the questions, all of it in a safe place. And we pray that they find safe people. And I'm thinking of the people who love those foster youth. We have such an opportunity to help these kids, those in our life, let them know you are not responsible for the actions of your parents or the inactions of your parents.
Yes. And I think too, the hardest place to process that is within church. From my own experience and a lot of other foster youth, where we've gone into church to heal, because that is where broken people go. And there are people, like, even I shared some stuff this week that has been happening with trying to get stuff from one of my siblings that is going into college and being told, like, well, no, you don't actually get that because this wasn't done correctly 8 years ago when you took them. This and this and this wasn't written the right way. It looks like they never were taken from the home. And I'm like, I have guardianship paper. I have court cases. I have all of this stuff to prove it. And they were like, that doesn't matter. And so I shared that because I'm just like, this is the reality of the other side of foster care is guardianship. And this is the reality of some of these kids are mislabeled in paperwork after paperwork after paperwork. And so people look at it and they go, why am I going to help you? And I was processing this and just kind of saying, like, this is the hard reality of what this looks like. And several people were just like, well, is this past stuff or current stuff? Do you just need to heal from the past? And I'm like, guys, we are horrible in the church community at letting people process and heal. And it will take decades to heal from decades of abuse. But it is also, even if it was only a year of abuse, that year of abuse is decades long to process. And I've noticed that we just don't know how to mourn with people. And it makes me like, I think of Job. Job is probably, I'm always going to mention Job because that was the first book that I actually read. And I said, oh, we're allowed to question.
Wow.
We're allowed to be like, wow, this hurts.
Yes.
And we're allowed to praise Jesus in the morning. And we're allowed to like go to the Bible and just be like, I don't get it. But where it was, I like had this like screeching halt moment wasn't just Danisha, be like Job, go be like Job. It was don't be like Job's friends. Because Job's friends first came along and they started mourning really well.
Right.
And then they were like, man, this morning it's a little too long, Job.
Right.
You must have done something.
Time to get over it.
And then it turned into, well, Job, what did you do? What? And I just like, I looked at this and I was like, oh, wow, God, like you put Job so specific in this. And I'm like, it's for me, obviously, because God thought about me putting Job in this Bible. And it's like, he thought about the church. He thought about the community where he goes, there's going to be people who mourn. And then there's going to be people who come alongside people to mourn, and they're not going to mourn well. And this is where I think it breaks my heart, because it's like, we will go through suffering, but then we put a timeline on how long you can suffer and mourn and process. And if we're doing that as the church, the whole church, everybody in the big C, we're missing a really big population of people to help and love on, because those foster youth, it's not just foster youth. It could be single parents. It could be people who have been cheated on, people who have been abandoned and bruised, people who have had someone killed in their life, miscarriages or deaths in their family. And if someone comes to them like a month later and goes, hey, why are you still talking about this? And I've experienced that. We had a miscarriage and someone like 2-3 months in, I'm like bawling and they're like, what's wrong? And I'm like, this is really hard. Like, I didn't think that this was going to be so emotional and hard. And they were like, oh, you're still crying about that? And I was like, oh, wow. And I just kind of left and was like, oh, that's not fun. But then still, like, even this week of just like processing this to be like, guys, this is the reality of like, if someone lies, it impacts people for decades with foster care. If someone doesn't write something down specifically and say, oh, yes, this happened, but then this was the outcome, you lose any support that they could have. And the response back to me has been, you know, is this past or current frustrations, past or current real situations happening? And I'm like, it's current. Oh, that's such a bummer, but oh, well. And that was the response I got was, well, I guess you'll just have to pick yourself up and figure it out. He's old enough. You're old enough. You have money. You can do it. And I'm like, it's not the point.
Right.
The point is there's someone who's in it right now, who someone is not taking detailed notes, and they are going to end up in this situation 8 to 10 years from now. And if we're not mourning with people and we're not pointing to Jesus and in a way that's just like, he sees you, he knows you, he loves you. This matters to him. We need to point in that way versus just like, well, Jesus doesn't want you to feel this. Just trust Jesus. And it's like, we make a mockery of real mourning and suffering. And that, like, for me, I'm like, church, we have to do better. for everybody, not just a specific group of people, but for every single person. It doesn't even matter if they stub their toe and a week later they're like, my toe is broken and it still hurts. Like, if you're in a cast, okay, but our emotions, our thoughts, our mind, they're not in a cast. You can't see the pain physically. You can't see it with your eyeball, but you can hear it. And if we dismiss it, that pushes people away from Jesus. Because we are a reflection of Jesus. We're not Jesus, but we are his reflection. And if we're not saying, I see you, I know you, I want to hear what you're going through. Right. I think sometimes we respond better to things like, oh, you went through a breakup in middle school and now you're 40 years old and you're still processing that. And it's like, some people are like, oh, that was really hard. That was really heartbreaking. But then with loss that is so close, we look at someone and they're like, okay, so it's been about a month and you're still crying about this. It's been 8 years and you're still crying about this. And it's like, no, that thing 8 years ago is still actually impacting me today. So it's hard to say, but it's like, we have to be better processors.
And we can be better. I think too, if we remember our rightful place as not the heroes, I do think it goes back to that. When I think I'm the savior, then I think I need to have the right things to tell you. And so instead of listening, I'm going to try to speak or come up with the right words at the right time, and which can feel so cliche and not helpful at all. Or we have our own timetable. Well, if I'm helping them, then it reflects on me if they're not better yet. I mean, I just think we might not consciously process all that, but I just think that's what's happening. And let's be people who sit long with people, weep well with people.
Yes. And I think there's another side is sometimes it's people don't know what it really entails, and a lot of us wait for that detail to be like, how much should I, like we do it all the time with like GoFundMe's. When a GoFundMe is posted, we don't just say, let me go help. We go, well, what's the story? Why should I donate to you? Why should I help you? And it's so desensitive because we've just been like, well, I mean, especially I think the last 3 years, we have just gotten so used to just like chaos everywhere that we're just like, that is what it is. And if we walk into someone's mourning with, well, it is what it is, get over it. That's not good. Or we go in and say, well, it could be worse. It could be a lot worse. I had it worse. Like it more of is that mentality. Like we need to just say, if we're going to mourn, we could step away and say, you know what? I'm not a good mourner. I'm the fun person. Cool. Go do that. Don't be in somebody's mourning corner. But if you're a good mourner, that's where you need to check yourself and say, am I coming in with the right mindset right now? Am I in it for the 2-year process that this might be for them? Am I in it for the long haul process that it might be? Do I have 6 weeks? Okay, maybe I should just be honest with that. Like, I have a timeline for mourning. Like, I have 6 weeks. Other cultures, they'll mourn for months. They'll mourn when someone dies. But we just are like, get back up tomorrow, come back to work, go back and do life and just move. And I think that we really have to start asking that question when we come in to mourn with someone. Am I a good mourner? Okay, if I am, is there a timetable on how much I will mourn with this person? And if that is a short period of time and they need a long period time mourner, I'm not going to be a good person in their corner. I will be there to mourn with them. I will be there as long as I can, but I'm not the person to walk with them long term. And being honest with that conversation.
Whew, man, so much here. Danisha, it has been a privilege to speak with you, to hear from you. I mean, truly, thank you for just continuing to use your voice to share the truth and share your experience and give other people a voice. Really, really appreciate you being on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I hope that today's episode encouraged you wherever you are on your foster care journey. We want you to stay connected, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you will never miss an episode. Also, we have great content at theforgotteninitiative.org. Thank you for watching. I cannot wait to be with you next time.